Go ahead, Valerie.
All right. So Kerri, I'm Valerie.
Hi, Valerie.
I wrote to you on email and all that and sent you all those questions.
Hi.
And we'll see how many we get to or not, but we're so glad that you're here.
Yay.
And I really, really enjoyed your book. It was lovely.
Thank you.
And I was wondering if we could start out learning a little bit more about you as the author, because looking at the book on the back, it says that you're a writer for like The Guardian and the Irish Times and such. But in your book, you don't mention how you came to be a writer. You talked about your time as teaching. And so I'm wondering if you could share with us your journey.
Completely. That's a really good question. I really wanted to write about the concept of writing and how I came to it in my book. Like, it was in all of the early drafts. And the editor that I was working with at Canongate, who were my first house, my British and Irish publishers, she had a really clear, it's a very old-fashioned view of writing, where she felt like it would break the spell if I mentioned the act or art of writing within the book. Mm-hmm. So every mention of writing the book or journal keeping or anything like that was cut from the edit.
Interesting.
Very early in. It's very common. It happens quite a lot with memoir. Like, it's this idea that it can kind of, that's the language that she used, like break the spell. Mm-hmm. And I get asked it repeatedly by writers who are in book groups or by people that I mentor or kind of anything like that. They're always kind of saying, oh, I wish there was more in the book about like how you came to it or whatever, because like it felt really odd to me, because like writing is I've been writing since I was like 4, so it's very much like who I am. But you'll notice it in a lot of British female memoir, like there's no mention at all of the act or the art of the writing whatsoever. It doesn't occur. It's a very common trope, like it just doesn't get allowed in. So like I've been writing since I was really young. I've kept a daily journal since I was 4. I've like long before Thin Places, I've been publishing widely. I've written alongside every job I've ever done before, so it just feels really natural to talk about it. And so I guess you're asking me in general about writing, or are you asking me specifically about the book?
In general.
In general, so like I've always written, always sent stuff in for publication, and had been having stuff published for a good while, but very different to Thin Places, which is the book that some of you may have read. And even the process of getting to the book that you've read was a pretty long journey, like from seed to flower,
Right.
And much more so than other writer friends I have who've written books. It went through a lot more hard kind of graft to get where it is. I think because of the nature of the content of the book, it just needed an awful lot of work around it. Started off as a children's illustrated story.
Really?
For North. Early rendition, which I still have. And then it kind of shape-shifted and it became a series of political essays called Mudlarking, and it won a few competitions in that embodiment, in that sort of form in the UK and in Croatia, interestingly. And then it changed again, and I cut it right back, and it became just a single form poem, which was published by the London magazine in London in the UK, and won a few things under that guise. And that was also called Mudlarking, like the series of political essays had been called. And then I kind of brought it, so it had been really a series of very political essays, and then it became this very poetic poem, and then I kind of brought it back out again to another series of essays that were much more life writing essays. They're very memoir based with politics in it, but very similar to what Thin Places then became. So it then won some mentoring and some money with a really incredible site in the UK in London called Spread the Word. And then I was granted money and mentorship with my choice of writer, and I chose my favorite writer, and we kind of really pulled it apart. And in the process of pulling it apart, I then decided I didn't want to work with it anymore, and I walked away from it for like 2 years. And then I gradually came back at it, and it became a single form essay, which kind of went a bit viral. And then I had like a lot of different publishing houses and a lot of agents and editors kind of calling and wanting to do something with this single form essay that they thought had just kind of come out of nowhere, you know, this overnight essay that had taken like kind of 12 years to create. And then Unnameable Things, the essay, then became Thin Places. But Thin Places itself, the book, went through 7 very heavy edits rather than just one. So it went from 100,000 words down to 20,000 words, up to 60, down to 40, up to 120, down to 90, down to 80, up to 90, and then it was done, you know. So it was a really and all of them read as separate books. They weren't like just kind of cutting out sections or adding in other little bits. They all read as separate books. They all have something distinctive enough in the edit that I could give you it and you would recognize the story, but you wouldn't recognize the book or the writing. So it's a very specific kind of creature, this book. Like I always knew it would be, but it is, and it was, and yeah. A big long answer for this really small question.
I'm glad you told us about it. That just seems overwhelming, and it really almost like this book that you've got became its own animal, its own being.
It always was. Like I always, when I describe Thin Places, I always describe it as a beast inside me that was clawing to get out. And then it got out, and thankfully, you know, it was okay. And actually, interestingly, loads of my friends who've published in the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Europe, when they then publish the same book in America, they have like a huge editing process because it needs to be made ready for readership in quite a different place. But really, really interestingly, absolutely nothing changed. Like Milkweed didn't change a single word, not a set, like not even a comma. There was 0 editing required for the book, which was really, it made me realize, I think, how translatable a trauma story is, and how that actually America is probably, if it went to Germany, it would need a lot more edits. Does that make sense? Even though Germany's much closer. The Irish story is, especially the Irish trauma story and the displacement story, is your story too. You know, maybe not you individually, but actually the book itself is about the collective, right? It's about what we share rather than what divides or separates us. So it really very much made sense to me that there would be, once I realized that there was going to be no edits, it really very much made sense. Like I think I had to explain a little bit for an essay that I did in the follow-up of publication with Milkweed. I had to explain a little bit about the Troubles, what the Troubles meant and but that was it. I mean, and in the book there was no, and the editorial process didn't require any of that for the book itself, which was quite, it really touched me actually. I know that sounds unimportant, but it spoke a lot to what I already knew, I think, in a way, that so much of what we experience in Ireland or have experienced in Ireland does directly impact on America. on
Yeah.
England and on America, you know, really big time.
And
And
Susan,
the book gets,
go ahead, I'm
oh,
sorry.
sorry. The book gets compared a lot with a lot of American female writers like Laura Savoy, Robin Wall Kimmerer, Annie Dillard. There are a lot of comparisons drawn that are drawn even in the UK and Ireland, like even from British reviewers. They'll pick up on that cross-pollination, I suppose. And if we think of those three writers that I've just mentioned, they all come from a background of displacement in a form or other. I mean, Annie Dillard, not so much so in relation to her sort of socio-economic geographical background, but really more in how she found her place in a world where people play in a capitalist world where people placed emphasis on things that she didn't feel there should be emphasis on, which is you know, really similar. Yeah.
So I like to open up our discussion to the rest of the group members so we can all get involved. And I know that Susan, you had a question kind of related to what she was just talking about with the displacement and our Native American cultures. Do you want to share that?
Yes, it reminded me so much of our Native American, how they, their connection with the land, and their different worldview, and the trauma that they've been put through by all of us who came from other places.
Totally.
So it felt like it fit very much with our story. And so
I would agree.
Yeah. And
the fact that that's a really, really important point, Susan. And I suppose as well the fact that when we look at where we're at as a civilization right now, like where the human race is at and what we've lived through in the last sort of decade, looking at things like climate crisis, the global pandemic, violence against women, against minority groups, what we're finding, I think, is that there is so much wisdom held within those communities of people who are affected the worst by those things. It's quite an interesting and intriguing concept that communities that are the worst hit by these vast humanly engineered experiences, if we can include the pandemic in that, the communities that are hit the worst will generally be within impoverished land spaces. And the reason why those spaces of land have become impoverished is the rape of the land. So in thin places, I look at why, you know, during all of the famines, there wasn't just one famine in Ireland. We know of this great one, and Gortamore, which was the Great Famine or the Hungry Famine. And it was the big one that everyone heard about, but there were famines in the run up to that, and there were famines after that. And during that time period, food was still being exported off the island of Ireland. So it's not this idea that we have in our mind that we were failed by the land or the crops failed us or something like that. Like, food was being removed and sent to England. And I suppose I've read a lot around the Dakota pipeline and things like that, and how that when we look at very, very displaced communities within very specific parts of the American landscape, there are, you know, the suicide rates are on the up, like within the Irish traveling community, the suicide rates are on the up amongst these protected communities that are no longer treated with respect. And the answers are there, like a return to communal living, a return to communion with the land and those non-human that we share it with. Moving away from a sort of a scarcity outlook where, oh, I need to take everything I need from my small little box because there isn't enough, you know, this scarcity mindset that human beings have come into. So even though we now have more of everything, if you ask any person on the street, they will feel like they've got less. So this real scarcity mindset. And so if you look at places like the north of Ireland, or, you know, settler settler places within America, like, you know, some of the complexes that say places like Heartberries, you know, that incredible memoir is based, and you think about this sort of rape that's happening there on so many different levels. And for me, they're really linked. Like I always say, how we treat the land is how we treat the people. And if we can't treat our land well, we're not treating each other well. So if we're not, so our mistreatment of the world, including the non-human species that we share it with, is, I feel, a direct embodiment of the low self-esteem that humanity is suffering with right now. You know, violence against women comes from a very deep self-hatred root within the male part of the population. Violence against children or other races is coming from self-disgust, really. And in a way that gives, weirdly, I know this sounds really surreal, but that gives me hope, because actually once we're disinterested and once we just stop, then we've stopped caring. So as soon as much as violence is horrific and anger is horrific, they speak to something that makes us human, that isn't lost yet, but just needs this tender care.
Yeah.
And I suppose what I'm trying to do with my work, all of my work, like Thin Places, the book I'm just finishing right now, Cacophony of Bone, all of the essays I write, the fiction I write, is to try and get down to the root of that. Like, what makes every single one of us human? Like, what makes us the same? Because it's there, and we know what it is. Like, we know when we waken after listening to these horrific mass shootings, or after these horrific banning, like forced pregnancy, for instance, or you know, deportees being people who've come in fleeing violence into the UK had been just about to be deported to Rwanda. And we know, like, we all know when we waken that this is not what we are as a species. Like, this is not who we are. I believe firmly that we all know. I feel that's why we're living in this crisis point, because enough of us know that it's wrong, and enough of us know that quite soon it needs to just totally change. Otherwise we will get to a point where a lot more will have to happen to change it. Now we're in a kind of a semi safe position, but I think any longer, like my son's generation will need to be a lot more on it than what we were, to very quickly stop those things when they come, rather than being as complacent as like my generation and definitely generations before were. Again, sometimes with these big things, we go in a very different direction than what we think we will. And in this conversation, it's sometimes really interesting to see with different groups what the outcome of the conversation can be. It's very intriguing.
Yes, for sure. And one thing that really resonated with me, and I don't know about for the rest of you, but what really resonated for me is that even though there was so much trauma that you talked about in this book, there was such a that theme of hope throughout the whole entire book that really was beautiful. And I know that a few of the people here have had questions about that. Like, I mean, how did you find the courage to write this book? Because I mean, it takes a great deal of courage to write about our inner feelings and to share them with the world.
Yeah, totally. That's a really beautiful comment and question, and I do get asked it a lot, and I suppose I'm always trying to give the purest, most simple answer for that question, but actually I don't really know. And I think that that what that speaks to is what we've just been talking about, how that there's something in all of us that we can't touch, that we can't quite word or name or explain in any kind of common layman terms, but we know it's what's keeping us here, right? Like it's something and it's keeping us here. And I'm not religious, but a lot of people would probably say that that's, you know, the hand of God or the presence of a bigger being than us. And I suppose that for writing the book, the courage came when I thought of others. So basically, I'd been given the strength to write the book because of all the people who'd come before me who'd written really similar books that I knew were really hard, that were really important for the canon of where I come from. And I felt that my story was so individual and spoke to such a different experience than what I'd ever read, that it felt if I didn't write it down, I would be doing a disservice to those that came after me who I knew would have experienced elements of it myself. And I guess I kept that at my core. My reader was like my light. And I was trying consistently to be fair to the reader and actually loving to my reader. Like I viewed my reader as a small child that I was trying to care for and keep safe. I wanted everyone who read this book to feel safe in the words that the book held. And I suppose that can bring courage if we are viewing our work as a space that we want to keep safe, like a kindergarten, like a Steiner kindergarten, for instance. If you've ever seen a Waldorf kindergarten, it's very warm, it's all wood and curves, there are no sharp edges, it's silks and wool and warm colors and softness. And I think I knew that the world and what happened in the world of the book, both of those things were going to be really sharp and hard and edgy. So if I could make anyone who came to the book feel safe within the confines of that book, and then when they went away to talk about it with their family or their friends, and they were maybe if they'd grown up with similar, like I've had readers who've messaged me saying, I moved to New York when I was like 15 and I never looked back, and I grew up during the Troubles, and I handed this book to my fiance or I handed this book to my children or whatever, and they understand me a bit better because of this. And that always makes, even when I think of that, like I'm ready to cry, knowing that that's the good that came from the bad that created the book, if that makes sense. And I suppose I didn't want to write this book, I needed to. And as soon as I finished the book, it didn't feel cathartic, it didn't feel a sense of relief. It was really hard. Like it was a horrible experience to write this book. Editing this book was the worst period of my life. When I'm so lucky, I feel so lucky that the pandemic arrived, because what it meant was I had no events. Like I marked the book being published by sitting in front of the fire in my small cottage in my pajamas eating pie that my partner had made me. Like there was no book launches. I didn't see it in bookstores. Like no one called me to go and talk about it at like an Alcohol Anonymous place or anything like that I would have probably had to go through if the book came out in the normal world. And now that it's been like years since it came out and the world is somehow returning a little bit to normal, I've had the space away from the book. Like I've written another book and I have a baby now, so I'm not the same person that I was when I wrote that book, and I'm really grateful for that. So I don't know how it would have gone if I'd had to continuously excavate even more so than the process of writing and editing. So I guess, yes, the bravery came from trying to do good in a place or in an experience that had been really bad. Because that's what all art is. All good art is trying to make good of bad. If we really, really break it down, good art is trying to fill a void or surface over or plaster over really deep wounds and cracks. And good art makes us feel clean, and it makes us feel safe. It makes us feel warm and sated, and that's what I was aiming for with the book.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
And as I was reading it, I used to be a high school English teacher, and I taught at a school that's on a border town between the Navajo reservation and Arizona. And so we had a lot of kids that it was at least 50%, maybe even more, that suffered trauma there. And I wish that this book had been part of my reading curriculum. Then I'm definitely going to suggest it to them, because a lot of times when you get a book about trauma, there's so much that's very explicit about the trauma that's happening. And I love that about your book, that you accept it, you recognize it, you focus on the hope.
Yeah, it's important. It's really important. And hope, like, for me, hope is the answer for everything. And I'm not talking about hope and optimism are different things. Like, optimism implies an outcome, and hope implies a present day. That's all it takes, is just being in the moment. And hope and gratitude are really finely intertwined for me. So I've really struggled. Like, I was really great with my mental health for a really, really long time. And then I was pregnant during the pandemic, and Ireland was kind of the worst hit in Europe with the pandemic and with our regulations. And it was very triggering in ways that I just wasn't expecting, like the childhood trauma that resurfaced. I wasn't expecting it. I just somehow thought that in the writing of the book it would go magically. But a lot of other memoirists experienced the same thing, that they found the pandemic exceptionally triggering, and just this lack of care from family, or lack of lack of extended community, which people with no family in their lives experienced, and the one and only thing. So I bought a fundraiser print from a very small indie art press in Ireland that were raising funds for different things during the pandemic, for different groups, cohorts that were hit. And I bought one that just said Dochartaigh, which is in the book. It's the Irish word for hope. And we framed it and put it above our hearth, our stove, our fire in our home. And I just made myself every single day for the time that we were here, just made myself stand in front of it and just think of 3 things every single day that I was grateful for, every single day, no matter how hard it was or dark it was or scary or overwhelming. And I still do it. I still do that every single day. It's one of the things that I picked up in the pandemic that I'm really glad I've kept. And you would be really surprised by the way hope and gratitude work together. Like, one is playing the tune and one is singing the song, and it's incredible. When people talk of grieving or anxiety, and how that hope is kind of really hard to come by in those times, I always advise gratitude. And yeah, I think that's what we need. We need to be grateful for what we still have, and the beauty that's still there, and the goodness that's still there, and the changes that can happen in people. And I suppose that's something that works finely with hope as well. Like, you hear stories of people who, well, I mean, in Ireland it was so common, politicians who just did complete U-turns, who, I mean, you cannot believe that these people changed the way that they did. And I've done a lot of work in prisons, and like with people who were prisoners, of political prisoners, and who've used writing as a way of kind of healing wounds. And it's wow, incredible.
Yeah.
The changes that can happen within a person. You know, actually a very good friend of mine, Max Porter, at the weekend, we were at a music and literature festival, a very big one in Ireland called Boris. And he was talking with another writer about the impacts of very right-wing media in America and in Ireland and the UK, and the detrimental impact it has on the average person in the street, you know, building hatred towards others, and how it's fueled by media. And he said, that's something that worries me a lot, worries me greatly, like people who rely on tabloids for their media, and how linked it is with individual states in America or counties in the United Kingdom. Like, you look at the readership or what they watch on television and how they vote, and you can see a correlation so easily. But he said, if we look at how impactful negative media is on people, if we would just cut that out, then what it means is that the opposite must be true. So really good, honest media that like explores humanity in a good, meaningful way will have the impact on our species that it needs to have. So just thinking of things in a way like that everything is possible rather than nothing is possible. So coming from a place where you just believe everything is possible, like children do. Children believe they can do everything and anything, and we bash that out of them. School batters that out of them. Parents batter that out of them. You know, the media batters it out of them. But we come to this. We come to this earth believing we can do anything, and and I firmly believe there's quite a lot that we can do. It just takes a lot of patience and goodness and togetherness.
Absolutely. I know that I've kind of monopolized all the questions. Does anybody have a burning question that they would like to jump in on? Yes, go ahead, Virginia.
I missed the introduction. I apologize. First of all, even the cover of this, I don't know if it's like this over in the UK.
It is. Yeah.
But it is just exquisite. And it in and of itself says so much. And then I know you've already addressed we as a component of all life on Earth. And how we kind of get into our little box and forget that there's so much about life, other life forms.
Totally.
And beautifully you expressed those commentaries, if you will, around those other life forms and how meaningful they can be to each and every one of us. Just wanted to acknowledge that. It really strikes deeply, and you did a beautiful job with that.
Thank you.
And then my burning question, very there's so many places, but this is the one I really want to go to. One of the places that you continuously speak about is your swimming. You're swimming in the sea, in the river, wherever there's a place to swim. You have to know, I was a very, very strong competitive swimmer, and I have swum in so many different locations, oceans, from one side of our country to the other. I've been down along the oceans there in both Ireland and in England. My whole heritage UK. But nevertheless, I don't believe that I ever stayed in the water as long as I walked away with the impression that you were in the water in these places.
Absolutely.
Could you please speak to that?
Absolutely. I spend an awful lot of time in the water. I follow not a school, a school of thought that repeatedly in and out builds your resilience to cold water. So
That's
getting
correct.
in,
Yes.
getting out, getting straight back in again, getting out, getting straight back in again. So I will stay in for those bouts of time that when I know that I can, like when your little toe is getting cold and then you need to get out, but then I will go straight back in. So I do push myself as much as I can because it's really who I am. So yeah, like when I go to the sea, I go and like I have my lunch, and if I could I'd have my dinner with me too. So I'll be, even in autumn or winter, be there for a very big stretch of time. Obviously, since having my son, that has changed a lot, and I feel the impact on me, feel the impact on my body, and I feel it on my brain, I feel it on my soul. Like I'm not getting into the water as much as I need to by any stretch of the imagination, maybe not even a tenth as much as I need to. I am still getting in a lot, and I am still staying in for as long as I can, but I've got something else that my body needs to do. I'm still breastfeeding my son. He's still very, very, very physically attached to me. He gets very anxious when I'm in for a long time. My dog gets very anxious. So and that's with my partner with them, that's with my partner with them and on the sand. But yeah, I mean, I would prescribe it as a form of healing. Like it's we're islanders. Irish people are islanders. British people are islanders. Like we need that connection with the water. I swam in my pregnancy. There was a huge period of time where we were locked down to 2 kilometers and there was no water within 2 kilometers of my home. And then we went up to 5 kilometer lockdown. There's no water within 5 kilometers of my home. So for a long time, at the point where I probably needed to swim the most, I couldn't. And then as soon as it opened, and the guards or the police in Ireland, they would let us go slightly further. I was just in the cold water. As my son, I swam with him until the day before I gave birth. And then really interestingly, Virginia, I don't know if you have children or not. I don't know if you cold water swim or not.
Yeah.
You have children and you cold water swim and on your skin rather than yes. So when I was giving birth, the midwives, a point came in the, I hope it's okay to talk about this, but a point came in giving birth. Yeah. A point came where I knew that my baby was coming, like really quite quickly, and I knew it. And I said, they'd gone out on a tea break, and I said to my partner, we really need to get them back in now. I think it's really like, we're talking a few minutes really. And they came back in and they were like, no, like you'd be in so much pain. You would have needed it. You haven't even had a paracetamol. You would have needed like gas and air, and you would be, honestly, like it would be really sore. Like, let's get your hours away. Like there's no pain for you really. And let's just get you up and we'll have a little check. So up on the table. Okay. Yeah. The head's there. Yeah, they couldn't believe that I hadn't even taken a paracetamol, that no pain relief at all, and maybe 10 minutes later my son was out, and they said at the like an hour in, they were like, we're really sorry about that. Like, it's not usual for that to happen in that way, that you didn't feel any pain. And I said, no, I felt pain. It's just, like I'm a cold water swimmer.
Yeah.
It's just, I know how to breathe my way through worrying waves, anxiety. I know how to do that. That's how I'm able to be in cold, deep water for a very long time. I had told them at the beginning of the birth that it would be, I'd find it easier. I'd been told it by cold water swimmers who were older than me, women who said, you need to be really mindful when you're giving birth, because they're not going to understand. That's where we're at. I tell everybody I know now who's pregnant, get in the water.
Thank you.
I have one quick question.
Yes.
I love the way you just keep bringing things back to a close study of the natural world. And I was wondering if you've read the poet Mary Oliver, because there were times,
every day of my life.
Wow.
Yeah. Her and Wendell Berry are probably apart from Irish writers, they would be my two most kind of commonly read. I have them by my bed, so they're both by my bedside.
I definitely wonderful. I love the way she asks questions like you do, and the way that she goes from that place of pain and trauma and grief, and
incredible. I am actually had a very deeply moving experience on the day that she died. I was in the queue boarding a flight to Copenhagen. I'd just gone sober. And this was cut out of this was in Thin Places, but because it pertained to writing, it was cut. And I was going to Copenhagen to begin the writing of the book, and I booked to go, and I was scrolling on my phone and realized in the queue that she had died. And at the point that I realized she died, a starling flew into the airport and landed on my luggage.
Wow.
And I know I do have experiences like this quite a lot. It does happen quite a lot to me, like a lot with creatures, foxes, birds. And and I sort of really grieved her in Copenhagen. It was a very interesting, deeply surreal couple of days. Yeah, she's incredible, right? Yeah.
Can I ask
You have
how learning Irish has affected you both personally and as a writer? And are you going to be teaching your son Irish?
very, very good question. We do, both my partner and I do use some Irish phrases with him, and we have done since he was in the womb. We always have with our dog as well. We've always spoken with her in Irish as well. And I have a very good friend, Mancon McGann, who writes both in the Irish language and about the Irish language, and who told me when I was pregnant that there was studies being done on children, babies, and how in utero and on their movements when they heard the Irish language. So I've been really affected through my pregnancy and through my son's life on that. Now, I'm still very much at learner level, but my friend Mancon, when he's with my son, will speak just Irish with him, to him. And my son loves it. It's a very beautiful, lilting, calming, safe language. It's not really a language, it's more I don't know, a series of songs, I suppose. But and how it's impacted on me as a person it has been a deeply nourishing, deeply, deeply healing thing. That's another thing that the pandemic has made really difficult for me, is the fact that I had to stop having lessons in person, because I find it really hard to learn on an app or on the computer. It was much better when I was having lessons in person. And then since becoming pregnant, the free time that I have is so limited that I now don't feel I'm giving myself enough of a chance with that very important part of me. Like with the swimming, it's something that I know I need. But I suppose that what happens in our lives is that we go through different renditions of who we are. And I mean, Laurie Anderson was talking about this at the event I did. Laurie Anderson, the incredible musician, performer, female sound performer. And she was talking about how that there are so many different versions of us that it must be incredibly difficult to define who we are. And so I was thinking about the fact that now, instead of giving my time to kind of learning that part of me and my history and my heritage, a lot more of my time is given to being outside, watching my son interact with the first time he sees things like butterflies, or how he will pull the poppies off the plants and give them to me, and how he imitates the cuckoo in the tree. And I suppose that is a gift I didn't think I was going to have. And that's something that I can only do now. Whereas I feel like the Irish language is always going to wait for me, and I'll come back when I'm ready. I have been able, luckily, to work with it in my second book, Cacophony of Bone, a lot more than I did with Thin Places. I look at the kind of poetry and knowledge that's held within the naming of the seasons in the Irish language, and that's been very good for me to be able to do that. But yeah, there's a time for everything.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about your next book, the one, Cacophony of Bone. Is that what you called it?
It's called Cacophony of Bone, and it's due in the UK and Ireland next spring. And I would be hopeful that it'll get picked up for an American audience, but you never know. It's a very, very different book. It's a much more, what's the word, fragmentary than Thin Places. So it follows a journalistic approach. So it's the course of a year, and it was the first year of moving. So it picks up exactly chronologically where Thin Places left off. It maps the course of my first year living in the cottage that we moved to. And it's like field journals, and very much about one place in microscopic detail, rather than lots of other places in fleeting detail. But it became a very different book. It was supposed to be about one person's experience of solitude and isolation, but of course the pandemic hit, so we were all isolated in that time period and all very alone. So I think it speaks a bit more to how, as a world, we approached the pandemic and these things that happened in very particular ways and how they affected us. So it's a very, very different book. My editor is a different editor, so it's going to be approached very differently and fragmentary. It's a bit like, I don't know if any of you have read any of kind of like Derek Jarman's diaries or Walt Whitmore's, but it's much more journalistic in a journal keeping way rather than in a tabloid newspaper way. So yeah,
Look forward to it.
Yeah, have to keep an eye out for it for sure.
For sure.
All right. I know that we're running short on time, but I wanted to just say one last thing. I love the title of this book, Thin Places, and I don't know, it just resonated with me so much, the idea that there are places that are like, I don't know, almost in between.
Totally.
You mentioned so many of these different places that you've been to. And I'm trying to remember if you mentioned any thin places in your travels outside of Ireland, or if you really only feel them in
So
Ireland.
I predominantly focused on thin places in the United Kingdom, so England, Scotland, Wales, and then looked a little bit at Iceland as well. Because actually I did, obviously there are places in Ireland too that I spent time in, but the bulk of the story of thin places kind of happened outside of Ireland in many ways, like the running away from. So there's a lot of impactful places for me that were on the British Isles, so England, Scotland, Wales. I have recently begun to feel very drawn, like incredibly drawn to Eastern Europe. We had planned, my partner and I, to go for a trip there, but with pandemic. Now we have a very small person who it might be difficult to travel that far with, but at some stage I'm feeling drawn there, really properly drawn there, and I'm feeling like that's my next kind of space of land to explore. But I mean, thin places are everywhere. Like I've had readers message me to tell me that they've been in Arizona at a burnt out fuel station and they've stopped for a pee, and they've been like, whoa, this place is really something, you know. Or another writer friend of mine said that she was on a concrete roundabout in Berlin. There are these concrete roundabouts in the middle of the motorway. She was on a random one of those, smoking with a friend, and she felt like, whoa, like there's something about this space. So yeah, they're everywhere. They are deeply rooted in Celtic tradition, but they are everywhere. I didn't write about India. The India section in my book was completely cut. I found out that I was very ill when I was on a self-directed university trip to India. I did my thesis on colonial literature, so comparing Ireland and India. And in the book I talk about having to have operations done, and I found out that I was really ill in India, so it felt like a very important thing for me to have in the book, but actually in reality it didn't need to be there. But lots of the places that I spent time in India were very thin. I mean, almost everywhere. And it makes you wonder, is there another thing that isn't a thin place? Is there another, is like the whole of some places just kind of special and otherworldly and ethereal and not necessarily good? They're not necessarily like better than anywhere else, or just something, you've probably experienced them yourselves.
Yes.
Right.
I would say if you ever want to come visit Alaska, there's a lot of wild creatures here and a lot of just absolutely knock you out sort of landscapes.
I would love to visit Alaska. That would just be incredible. Yeah, I'm drawn to landscapes like that, like I always have been. And yeah, there's something very different from very drastic landscapes than non-drastic landscapes, but they're not necessarily any different as like thin places either. So yeah, it can be, you're right, it can be anywhere really.
All right. Well, I think that this is our time. Is that right, Tanya?
Yes,
All right.
it has been really enjoyable.
Thank you for having me. It's been great to talk.
And I'm glad to hear you narrated your own audiobook of this, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
I
because
did.
just listening to you speak
Mhm.
in English is like a song. But I can imagine
I loved doing it. I had this beautiful experience where I realized that when you're doing your audio, you're in a really small room, and because of the pandemic, the person who was leading me in how to do it, the director, had to stay in London. She couldn't fly over, so she was doing it on a screen. And I was pregnant with my son, and so the first person who ever heard me read anything from the book was my little baby.
Oh, that's
So it
wonderful.
felt really special.
Oh yeah.
Like really lovely.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you for sharing
Thank
this,
you
all
so
of this with
much.
us.
Yes,
We love
it's
you,
beautiful.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.